Greetings, dear friends. Today I would like to present our new device ATP-3000, which allows you to program Hella actuators along with its testing. It is an analog of the ATP-1000 Tester except the main testing function with additional programming functionality. This is what we are going to talk about today. More precisely, we will talk about how Hella actuators can be programmed with this device. This device is still in testing for 15 June 2023 and will go on sale after testing. Switching on the device. We have a Programmer tab with programming options for Hella and Siemens. Siemens programming has already been discussed, and this function has been available for a long time. It is available in the ATP-1000 device, but Hella is a new function. What you can do, you can read the firmware and write the firmware. You can also save these firmware files to the device. And we also gave an additional function. Firmware can be recorded on the computer and later shared with other users who have the same device. For example, you have a certain model of the actuator, you have the firmware for it in the device, or directly in the actuator itself. You can read the firmware, then from the device this firmware is uploaded to the computer and this file is transferred to your friends, or to another service station that you have. They will transfer this firmware to their own device with the help of our program on the computer and will be able to flash the actuator with this firmware in the future. Read function. Let us connect the actuator. And read the firmware. In this case I sign to myself that it is a 712/120 cover. Okay, here's a read of what we can see. You can see that there is the type of cover, the firmware that is written here, the angles that are written, the direction of rotation, the direction, and the type of control. In this case, this actuator is controlled by PWM at 140 Hz. If you want to save this firmware, you have read the data from the cover, you want to save it, you press OK next. And you are prompted to save this firmware into any of the 99 cells. So, for example, you choose the first cell. Or we can choose any other cell, just for the sake of example. For example, we want to write the firmware of this actuator into the third cell. So we press OK. You're prompted once again that this firmware will be written to cell number 3, save that cell. Or there is an option where you can reset a cell. For example, there is something already written in this cell now, maybe you don't need it, you can clear it separately by selecting this menu item and pressing OK, the cell will be cleared. For example, we know it's already clean, but we decide to clear it again. So we save again. Everything. In the third cell, there is now an actuator with cover 712/120 with G number 002. Note that this cover number right here should match the actuator number. So if you take, for example, another cover, there is 730th, then firmware 712 will not fit it. The device won't even let us program this. It will give us an error, say the devices don't match, but still, just so you know. To return from this menu, press back. Back again. We go into record mode. There are three options from where we take the data for the actuator firmware. That is, we can take it from the ATP memory, which is how in this case, we have now written it. We can take it directly from the actuator. For example, we have one actuator and we want to rewrite the same firmware, for example, to another actuator immediately. So we can select the From Actuator menu. There is also the From PC menu. That is, when you can reflash the firmware from your computer to the device and then upload it to the actuator. We will now look at all of these options in turn. Let's see how they're done. For example, we want to take the firmware directly from the device memory. We select From ATP. The firmware list is displayed again. For example, we'll go with option number 3. It's actually recorded here now, but we'll try it as an option. What is revealed is what will be recorded. You click OK again. You are asked if you want to record or go back. You press OK. It reads the data from the actuator, checks whether the firmware matches, whether it can upload its own firmware to this actuator, and programming takes place. Programming is over. Let's go in again. Now, for example, we want to read the firmware from an actuator and flash it to another actuator. We press OK. The firmware is now being read from this actuator. So it's still there, it's still there. I'm going to press pause and switch to the next actuator with this cable. So we've switched over. And we want to flash that firmware to this actuator here. Press the OK button, ask him what he's programmed. He's checking again to see if this actuator fits the firmware that was on this actuator, but I'll say right off the bat that these are both 712/120 covers. But let's try to read it now, see what's recorded. And so we can see that this actuator has firmware too. And we'll look at the third option. We'll look at it more broadly, which is from PC. In order to work with a computer, in order for the device to work with a computer, it must be connected to a computer using the USB connector. Plugged in. Next, run the software provided in the package on the computer. It's called ATP-3000 Programmer. It looks like this. We have two columns. And there's a connection node. There's a prompt here to tell you what you need to do. In order for us to start working with the computer, you need to select the COM port that corresponds to our device. Once connected, you will need to look in Device Manager to see what COM port appears. In this case, I know it is COM10. I select COM10, click Connect. Note that as soon as I click Connect, the device will automatically reboot. So the moment the sound happens, I press connect. We now have the device connected to a computer. We enter the Hello programming menu. I'm going to show you a few things you need to know. How can I read the firmware from the actuator and then write it to the computer? You go into read mode. It reads the firmware, wait for the OK message. So here's the data you've read, now you want to save it to the computer, for example. There are buttons here that tell you what to read from the ATP. Then there's the Save to File button. Let's go one by one. Read from ATP, that is, once you have received the data from the device, from the actuator, you can download it to the computer. So you click Read from ATP, and it's downloaded. And you have all the data that is on the instrument, even a little more, listed here. So here's cover number 712-120, G number 2, serial number 178, stop 6, second stop 114, control range 108. PWM control type, rotate anti-clockwise. Once again we will compare, that is, these data, there is even a little bit more data, but they are not so relevant. Most companies give, most manufacturers of testers give these data, we have also deduced them. Now if you are satisfied and you want to save this firmware, you click Save to File. You'll see a message pop up where you will save to, so initially we already give you folder options by cover type. In this case, we have a 712-120 cover. And we have this firmware here, but let's say we want to save it somehow, so you type in its name. 002, let's call it a test. And press OK. And that firmware is now saved to your computer in a folder. If you want to open this firmware, then you click Open from File. Well, let's look at an example of not this firmware, but let's say we want to load on our actuator, for example, the firmware number 145. We press OK. We fill in these fields with all the parameters that are required here. You can see the cover number, G-code number, start, stop, control range, direction of rotation, and for example for the 145th variant the control will be performed via CAN. Next, to download this firmware for G-code number 145 you need to go to the Record menu. Select from PC. That is, initially all fields here will be empty. Here press the Write to ATP button. Write this data to ATP. I'm going to put it back on the device so you can see when I press the button. We've got this data coming in. Once again, I will show you how it happens here. That is, when you click on Write to ATP, this blue bar runs, Progress, and you have the data appear here. And then you can record that data. Like this actuator cover here. You press OK. You will be asked again if you are sure you are going to program or not. You press OK. And wait for the programming. End of programming. First it reads the data, it checks if the firmware matches this cover. If everything fits, it's okay? So let's try to read it and see what's in it. So we can see that we had firmware 002 on this actuator before, but we decided to load firmware 145, and here we can see that it's all loaded. We can even test it. Go into tester mode. Actuator test, Hella. Select, for example, 412. Basically, all the ones that are connected by the red and blue cable. You can choose 412, for example, connecting. And so we see that the control takes place via CAN. Let's try to control. The control works. Now, there is a point that all the firmware that we give, well, actually as well as the firmware coming directly from the factory, they are all standardized. But for a turbo, sometimes you need to adjust the angle, the range in which it will adjust. The angles are changed in the direct test mode. To do that, you should have off here, you turn the knob to the right. And here we have the parameters of the firmware, which is now uploaded here, with the parameters of the angles. If you want to change them, you do the following, click OK. You get an arrow next to the angle you want to change. For example, we want to change this angle by 20%. And we want to change this one to 100%. You press OK again. And then you see Save. If the arrow is on Save, you rotate it until it says Run. And click OK. You're gradually making the run sign disappear. You'll see dots appear here. And when you're done, it'll say OK. And so we've got the angles changed. We go back to the main menu and control already with these angles. Let's check again in the angle change programming mode. I'm sure it's fine. But just to make sure it's changed, we're going to take another look in this mode. So we see that the cover is G145, and now the angles have been changed 20% and 100%. And so these are the parameters that we want to download back to the computer. We press Red from ATP again. And we can see that the parameters have changed here as well. This reading function is useful if you have a turbo with the correct actuator running. So in this case, you can download all the correct parameters directly from the actuator that is on the turbo. As I said, we have default firmware for these actuators, but when the actuator is already on the turbo, sometimes you need to adjust it. So, if you removed a good turbo from a good car with a good actuator, you can download the firmware from there too and get not just the default firmware, but the firmware that fits directly to this turbo. This seems to be the end of all the functions we have created, labeled, showed how to use our new device. Recommended. It's clear that we are a good company to contact. We try to maintain our equipment in terms of technical support. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. We are always ready to help, advise, share the knowledge that we have, so that your work is more efficient, of higher quality, and you can deal with the maximum number of turbos. Also a reminder that if you have actuators that you don't know how to work with, you can contact us too. In this case, we study this actuator. If we manage to connect to it and develop software, then in this case, we send either a new firmware for the device or an additional cable that allows us to work with this type of unknown actuator. In this way we expand the range of actuators that we are able to support. And you get a cable that allows you to work quietly with our instrument with a new type of actuator.